The dust settled on the freshly turned earth of Sarah's grave, and Daniel Jackson felt something inside him settle too, something cold and final that he knew would never warm again. It was April 1878, and the Arizona Territory had taken another soul, this time the one he loved most in this world. He stood alone on the rise behind his ranch house, hat in his calloused hands, watching the sun bleed red across the Williams horizon. The cattle lowed in the distance, oblivious to his loss, and the spring grass bent in the warm wind that carried the scent of mesquite and creosote. His foreman, Miguel, had offered to stay, but Daniel had sent everyone away. He needed to be alone with his grief, though he suspected it would be a companion far longer than he wished. Sarah had been his wife for 7 years, and in that time, she had transformed his rough bachelor existence into something resembling civilization. She had planted flowers that somehow survived the harsh climate, cooked meals that made the bunkhouse hands jealous, and laughed in a way that made even the hardest days bearable. The fever had taken her in less than a week, burning through her body faster than any wildfire he'd ever fought. The doctor from Williams had arrived too late, his remedies useless against whatever sickness had invaded her lungs. Daniel had held her hand as she slipped away, promising things he now had no heart to fulfill. She had made him swear he would keep living, keep the ranch going, find happiness again. That last promise felt like the cruelest lie he'd ever told. He walked back down the hill as twilight gathered, each step heavy with exhaustion that went beyond the physical. The ranch house waited, dark and empty. He couldn't bring himself to light the lamps. Instead, he sat on the porch and let the darkness wrap around him like a shroud. Sleep would not come easy tonight, nor for many nights to come. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of work and silence. Daniel threw himself into the running of the ranch with an intensity that worried Miguel. He was up before dawn, working until he could barely stand, then falling into bed too exhausted to dream. The spring roundup came and went. The cattle were branded and moved to higher pastures. The books were kept, the hands were paid, and the ranch continued as it always had. But Daniel felt like a ghost moving through his own life, going through motions that had lost all meaning. It was late May when Miguel brought news that would change everything, though Daniel didn't know it then. They were in the barn, checking the tack, when Miguel cleared his throat in that way he had when something was on his mind. "Boss, you heard about the Caldwell place?" Daniel looked up from the bridle he was examining. "What about it?" "Bank took it. Mr. Caldwell died back in February and his widow couldn't keep up with the payments. They put her out 2 days ago." Daniel felt a pang of sympathy cut through his numbness. He knew Richard Caldwell had traded cattle with him a few times. Good man, solid rancher. That's rough. "She have family to go to." Miguel shook his head. "That's the thing, boss. She's alone, far as anyone knows. Been staying at the boarding house in town, but word is she's running through her last dollars pretty quick. Some of the church ladies are trying to help, but you know how that goes." Daniel did know. Charity was fine for a week or two, but eventually people expected you to stand on your own feet, regardless of whether you had any ground to stand on. "What's her plan?" "Don't think she has one. She's young, maybe 25 or so. Caldwell was her second husband. First one died in a mining accident up north before she came here. She's had some hard luck." Daniel returned his attention to the bridle, but his mind was working. He didn't know the widow personally, but in a small community like Williams, everyone's troubles were known. The ranch had been doing well before Caldwell's death. The man must not have left things in order, or maybe the grief had overwhelmed her, made her miss payments. Daniel understood that better than most. If Sarah had been the one to survive, he wondered if she would have fared any better. Why are you telling me this, Miguel? The foreman shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. Well, boss, I know you've been hurting since Miss Sarah passed, but the ranch needs a woman's touch. The house is falling apart inside and you're barely eating enough to keep a bird alive. I was thinking maybe the widow could use work and we could use help. Just a thought. Daniel's first instinct was anger. The idea of another woman in Sarah's house, using Sarah's kitchen, sleeping under Sarah's roof, it felt like betrayal. But as quickly as the anger came, it faded into that familiar numbness. Miguel was right about the house. Dust covered every surface, dishes piled up in the kitchen, and his clothes were starting to develop a permanent layer of grime because he couldn't remember the last time he'd done laundry properly. He'd been eating mostly beans and hardtack, too tired and too empty to care about proper meals. I'll think about it, Daniel said finally. 2 days later, he found himself riding into Williams, telling himself he was going for supplies. The town was bustling with the usual late spring activity. Freight wagons rolled down the main street, kicking up dust that coated everything. Cowboys from various ranches lounged outside the saloon, waiting for their pay and their chance to blow it all on whiskey and cards. Women in sun-faded dresses hurried between the general store and the butcher, while children played in the alleys, their shouts mixing with the sounds of hammers from the new construction on the edge of town. Daniel tied his horse outside the general store and went in, nodding to the proprietor, Sam Henderson. He gathered the supplies he needed: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, taking his time, working up the courage for what he'd actually come to do. Finally, as Sam was tallying his purchases, Daniel spoke. I heard about the Caldwell widow. She's still in town. Sam looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face. Victoria Caldwell. Yeah, she's still at the boarding house, running pretty thin from what my wife tells me. You know her? Not personally, but I heard she might be looking for work. Understanding dawned in Sam's eyes, followed quickly by approval. That's Christian of you, Daniel. She's a good woman, from what I hear. Richard spoke highly of her before he passed. Came here from Colorado after her first husband died. She's had a rough time of it. Daniel just nodded, paid for his supplies, and headed back out into the bright sunlight. The boarding house was at the far end of town, a 2-story structure with a sagging porch and peeling paint. Mrs. Henderson ran it, a widow herself who took in travelers and the occasional down-on-their-luck resident. Daniel had never had cause to visit before. He climbed the steps and knocked. Mrs. Henderson answered, her round face breaking into a smile when she recognized him. Daniel Jackson. What brings you to my door? You're not looking for a room, I hope. Ranch burned down. No, madam. I'm looking for Victoria Caldwell. I heard she might be staying here. The smile faded, replaced by sympathy and curiosity. She is, poor thing. Let me get her for you. Come in, come in. Daniel stepped into the dim hallway, removing his hat. The house smelled of boiled cabbage and old wood. He could hear voices from upstairs, the creak of floorboards. Then footsteps on the stairs, and Mrs. Henderson returned with a woman following behind her. Victoria Caldwell was not what Daniel had expected, though he wasn't sure what he had expected. She was tall and slender, with dark brown hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her dress was clean but worn, mended in several places with careful stitches. But it was her eyes that struck him, green as spring grass, but carrying a weight that he recognized. She had the look of someone who had lost everything and was still trying to figure out how to keep breathing. Mrs. Caldwell, this is Daniel Jackson. He owns a ranch outside town. Daniel, this is Victoria. Madam, Daniel said, his voice rough from disuse. He suddenly felt awkward, unsure how to proceed. I wonder if I might have a word with you." Victoria glanced at Mrs. Henderson, then back at Daniel, wariness in her expression. "Of course, Mr. Jackson." Mrs. Henderson ushered them into a small sitting room off the hallway, then discreetly disappeared. Daniel waited until Victoria sat in one of the worn chairs before taking a seat himself. He turned his hat in his hands, searching for the right words. "I heard about your situation, madam. About losing the ranch. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Victoria said quietly. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the strain beneath it. "Richard was a good man. I should have managed better after he passed, but I'm afraid I wasn't prepared for the business side of things." "Grief makes everything harder," Daniel said, and their eyes met for a moment, recognizing shared pain. Victoria nodded slowly. Yes, it does." Daniel took a breath. "I lost my wife 6 weeks ago. Fever took her fast. Since then, I've been trying to keep the ranch going. But I'll be honest with you, madam, I'm doing a poor job of managing the household side of things. My foreman suggested I might find someone to help with the house, the cooking, that sort of thing. I know you're in need of work, and I'm in need of help. I'm prepared to offer you room, board, and $30 a month if you're willing." Victoria's expression shifted, surprise and hope warring with something that might have been fear. "That's very generous, Mr. Jackson. But I should be honest with you as well. I'm not a young girl looking for adventure. I'm 26 years old and I've been widowed twice now. Some people think that brings bad luck. I'm not superstitious," Daniel said. "And I'm 32, old enough to know that luck, good or bad, isn't something we control. I'm offering work, that's all. Nothing improper. You'd have your own room, your privacy respected. I just need someone to keep the house from falling down around my ears while I try to keep the ranch running." Victoria studied him for a long moment, and Daniel had the sense she was seeing more than he intended to show. Finally, she nodded. "When would you want me to start? I've got a wagon full of supplies. I could take you out today if you're ready. I'll get my things." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Victoria sat beside him on the wagon seat, her few possessions packed in a single carpet bag at her feet. Daniel pointed out landmarks as they traveled, the boundary of his land, the creek that ran year-round, the line of cottonwoods that marked the western edge of his property. Victoria listened and nodded but said little. He sensed she was exhausted, emotionally and physically, and he understood that too. When they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Daniel saw it with fresh eyes. The house was solid, built of adobe with a shake roof, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. It had been a source of pride once. Now he saw the weeds growing unchecked in Sarah's flower beds, the shutters that hung crooked, the general air of neglect. "It needs work," he said, his voice flat. "It has good bones," Victoria replied, and there was something in her tone that made him glance at her. She was looking at the house with an expression he couldn't quite read, longing mixed with sadness. He pulled the wagon up to the house and helped Victoria down, then carried her bag inside. The interior made him wince. He'd gotten used to the mess, but seeing it through her eyes, he realized how bad it had gotten. Dishes were piled in the dry sink, dust covered every surface, and the air was stale and close. "I'll show you where you'll be staying," he said, leading her down the short hallway. There were 3 bedrooms in the house. The master bedroom where he slept, Sarah's sewing room that had never been finished, and a guest room that had rarely been used. He opened the door to the guest room. It was the cleanest room in the house, mostly because no one had been in it for months. A simple bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "This will be fine," Victoria said. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson." "Daniel," he said. "If we're going to be sharing a house, might as well use first names. I'll call you Victoria if that's all right. It's fine. And please, most people call me Tori. He nodded, suddenly wanting to escape the confines of the house and the awkwardness of this whole arrangement. I'll let you settle in. Kitchen's yours to do with as you please. If you need anything, I'll be around. Miguel, my foreman, he can help you with anything heavy. Then he fled, back out into the sunlight and the familiar comfort of work. That first week was strange for both of them. They moved around each other like ghosts, speaking only when necessary, careful not to intrude on each other's grief. Daniel kept himself busy outside, riding fences, working with the cattle, anything to avoid the house. But he noticed the changes, the smell of fresh bread when he came in for lunch. Clean dishes, swept floors, the windows thrown open to let in fresh air. Sarah's flower beds weeded and watered. Slowly the house was coming back to life. Tori worked with quiet efficiency, never asking for help, never complaining. She cooked simple but hearty meals and left them warming on the stove for when Daniel finally dragged himself inside. She did his laundry without being asked, mended his shirts, and somehow found time to start organizing the chaos he'd created in the 6 weeks of his grief. It was 2 weeks after her arrival when they had their first real conversation. Daniel came in from a long day of branding to find Tori sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. She had a cup of coffee in her hands and looked more relaxed than he'd yet seen her. On impulse, he poured himself a cup and joined her, taking the other chair. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to red to purple. Finally, Tori spoke. Richard and I used to watch the sunset every evening. It was his favorite time of day. He said it reminded him that no matter how hard the day had been, there was beauty if you knew where to look. Daniel thought about that. Sarah liked the mornings best. She said every dawn was a fresh start, a chance to do better than the day before. They were both right, I suppose. Suppose so. More silence, but it was comfortable, the silence of two people who understood that sometimes words weren't necessary. Daniel found himself studying Tori from the corner of his eye. She looked healthier than she had that first day in town. There was color in her cheeks, and some of the tightness around her eyes had eased. Work agreed with her, or maybe it was just having a purpose again. "Can I ask you something?" Tori said suddenly. "Sure. Why did you really offer me this job?" Most ranchers would have just hired a woman from town to come out once a week, or asked one of the hands' wives to help. You didn't know me. You had no reason to trust me. Daniel considered the question, wanting to give her an honest answer. Miguel suggested it, initially. But when I came to town, when I saw you, I recognized something. You had that look I've been seeing in the mirror every morning. Like you're just going through the motions, doing what needs to be done because stopping isn't an option, but not really caring much about any of it. I thought maybe we could help each other. I needed someone to keep the house going, and you needed a place where you could grieve without everyone in town watching and judging. Tori was quiet for a moment. Thank you for that, for understanding. Most people in town were kind, but there's a difference between kindness and understanding. Yes, there is. After that night, something shifted between them. They began eating meals together, started talking more. Not about anything deep at first, just the small details of running a ranch and a household. But gradually, as May turned into June and the Arizona heat settled in for the summer, they began to share more. Tori told him about her first husband, Thomas, who had been a miner in Colorado with dreams of striking it rich. He died in a cave-in, leaving her alone in a strange town with nothing but debts. She'd made her way to Arizona, looking for a fresh start, and had met Richard Caldwell at a church social. He'd been a widower himself, 20 years her senior, kind and steady. Their marriage had been one of companionship more than passion, but she'd been content. Daniel talked about Sarah, about how they'd met at a dance in Prescott, how she'd been visiting from Missouri and had decided Arizona suited her just fine, especially after he'd courted her with all the awkward enthusiasm of a man who'd spent too much time around cattle and not enough around people. He told Tori about their plans, the children they'd hoped for but never had, the life they'd been building together that had ended far too soon. These conversations usually happened in the evenings after the work was done. Sometimes on the porch, sometimes in the parlor while Tori mended and Daniel worked on the ranch accounts. There was comfort in the routine, in having another person around who understood loss. June brought the full force of summer, with temperatures that could kill the unprepared. The cattle moved slow in the heat, and the men worked early mornings and late evenings, resting during the worst of the afternoon sun. Tori adapted to the rhythm, having meals ready at odd hours, keeping water cool in the root cellar, and somehow keeping the house bearable despite the heat. It was during one of those brutal afternoons that trouble arrived. Daniel was in the barn, working on repairing a saddle, when he heard horses approaching fast. He stepped out into the blinding sunlight, shading his eyes, and saw 3 riders coming up the road at a gallop. Dust billowed behind them, and even from a distance, Daniel could tell something was wrong. Miguel emerged from the bunkhouse, and together they watched the riders approach. They were hands from the Broken Creek Ranch, which bordered Daniel's property to the north. The lead rider pulled up hard, his horse lathered and blowing. "Jackson, we got trouble. Fire on the range started by lightning last night. It's spreading fast, heading toward your northern boundary. Mr. Palmer sent us to warn you and ask for help." Daniel felt ice in his stomach despite the heat. Wildfire was every rancher's nightmare. In this dry season, it could sweep across miles in hours, killing everything in its path. "How far?" he demanded. 5 miles from your fence, but moving fast with the wind." "We're trying to set a fire break, but we need every man." Daniel turned to Miguel. "Get everyone who can ride. Wet down the barn and the bunkhouse before you go. I'll get tools and catch up." As the men scattered, Daniel ran for the house. Tori met him at the door, her face pale. She'd heard enough to understand the danger. "Fire," Daniel said shortly. "I need to grab some things and go. You need to be ready in case it comes this way. If you see smoke getting close, take my good horse, the bay, and ride for town. Don't wait for me." "I can help," Tori said. "I can bring water, food for the men. It's too dangerous." "Daniel, you'll be out there for hours, maybe days. You'll need supplies. Let me do this." He wanted to argue, but there was steel in her eyes, determination he hadn't seen before, and she was right. They would need supplies. He nodded shortly. "Load up the wagon with whatever water containers we have, food that won't spoil, and blankets in case anyone gets burned. But stay back from the fire line. Promise me." "I promise." The next 36 hours blurred into a nightmare of smoke and heat. The fire was massive, a wall of flame that stretched across the horizon, driven by capricious winds that shifted direction without warning. Daniel and his men joined forces with the Broken Creek crew and ranchers from 3 other properties, all fighting together to save their livelihoods. They dug fire breaks, cleared brush, and set backfires to rob the main blaze of fuel. Men worked until they dropped, then forced themselves up to work more. The smoke was thick enough to choke on, turning day into twilight. Daniel lost track of time, knowing only the immediate need to stop the flames from reaching his land. Tori appeared periodically like an angel through the smoke, bringing water, food, and clean cloths for burned hands. She worked tirelessly, never complaining, helping where she could and staying out of the way when she couldn't. Daniel saw her bandaging a man's blistered hands, her movements gentle but efficient. He saw her giving water to men too exhausted to do more than drink and nod their thanks. And once, when the fire made a sudden run toward their position and everyone scrambled to fall back, he saw her helping an older rancher who'd twisted his ankle, supporting his weight as they retreated to safety. By the second evening, they were winning. The wind had shifted, pushing the fire back on itself, and the fire breaks were holding. Men stood watching the dying flames with red-rimmed eyes, too tired to speak. Daniel found himself sitting on the ground, his back against a wagon wheel, staring at nothing. His hands were blistered, his throat raw from smoke, and every muscle screamed with exhaustion. Tori appeared beside him with a cup of water. He drank it gratefully, then looked up at her. Her face was streaked with soot, her dress was ruined, and her hair had come loose from its pins. She'd never looked more beautiful. "You should have stayed at the house," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're welcome," she replied, but there was a smile in her eyes. He found himself smiling back, and it felt strange, like using muscles he'd forgotten he had. "Thank you. You probably saved a few lives today, getting water to everyone. We all did what needed doing." That simple statement, so matter-of-fact, seemed to sum up everything he'd come to admire about her. She didn't seek credit or praise. She just saw what needed to be done and did it. Like running a household she'd never seen before. Like stepping into a life that must have reminded her painfully of what she'd lost. Like facing a wildfire to help people she barely knew. They rode back to the ranch together in the wagon, too tired for conversation. The sun was rising, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of pink and orange. The land around them was black and desolate where the fire had passed, but Daniel's property had been spared. The fire break had held. At the house, Tori insisted on treating his burns and making him eat before she'd let him rest. Daniel submitted to her care, too exhausted to argue. Her hands were gentle as she smoothed salve on his blistered palms, wrapping them in clean bandages. When she was done, he caught her hand, stopping her as she started to rise. "Tori, I meant what I said. Thank you for everything." She looked down at their joined hands, then at his face. Something flickered in her eyes, an emotion he couldn't name. "You'd have done the same for me." "Yes," he said simply. "I would." The moment stretched between them, laden with things neither was ready to say. Then Tori gently pulled her hand free and stood. "Get some sleep, Daniel. Everything else can wait." July brought a string of brutally hot days and the inevitable slow pace of summer ranch work. In the aftermath of the fire, the ranching community drew together. Daniel found himself socializing more than he had in months, attending a barn raising at the Broken Creek Ranch, a Sunday service in town, a meeting about organizing better fire response for next year. And Tori was always at his side, fitting naturally into the role of his hostess, though neither of them spoke about what that meant. The other ranchers' wives welcomed her warmly, drawing her into their circle with an ease that surprised Daniel. He watched her laughing with Sarah Palmer, the Broken Creek owner's wife, discussing recipes and trading advice about dealing with the heat. He saw her holding a friend's baby with such longing in her eyes that it made his chest ache. And he realized with a start that he was watching her the way a man watches a woman he cares for. The realization unsettled him. It felt like betrayal, like he was being unfaithful to Sarah's memory. But Sarah had been dead for 3 months now, and Tori had been living in his house, sharing his meals, filling the silence with her presence for 6 weeks. When had she stopped being just the widow he'd hired and become someone essential to his life? He tried to ignore the feeling, throwing himself back into work, keeping his distance. But it was hard to maintain distance when they lived in the same house. And it was harder still when Tori seemed to sense his withdrawal and responded with a careful distance of her own. The easy conversation stopped. The comfortable silences became awkward. The house felt cold despite the summer heat. Miguel noticed, of course. His foreman saw everything. They were riding the southern boundary, checking for breaks in the fence when he brought it up. "You're going to lose her if you keep this up, boss." Daniel stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. That woman has brought this place back to life. She's good for the ranch and she's good for you, but you're pushing her away because you feel guilty for being happy." "I'm not happy." "No, but you could be. And that's what scares you. You think Miss Sarah would want you to spend the rest of your life mourning. Because I'll tell you, boss, she wouldn't. She loved you. She'd want you to live." Daniel wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because Miguel was right. Sarah had made him promise to keep living to find happiness again. He'd thought it was impossible at the time, a promise he'd never have to keep. But now, with Tori's presence reshaping his days, he realized it wasn't impossible at all, and that terrified him. "What if I lose her too?" he said quietly. "What if I let myself care and then she's gone? That's the risk we all take," Miguel said gently. "But the alternative is living like a ghost in your own life. You're not dead, boss. Stop acting like you are." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. He thought about Sarah, about the life they'd had and the life they'd never have. And he realized that while he would always love her, would always carry her memory, she was gone. Holding on to his grief wouldn't bring her back. It would only keep him from living the life she'd wanted for him. He thought about Tori, about the strength she'd shown in facing her losses and still finding the courage to keep going. She'd been widowed twice, had lost everything, and yet she still got up every morning and found reasons to smile. She still saw beauty in sunsets and took pride in simple work done well. She still had hope, and that hope was contagious. Sometime before dawn, Daniel made a decision. He didn't know if Tori felt the same pull he did, didn't know if she was ready for anything beyond the arrangement they'd made. But he knew he had to try. Miguel was right. He wasn't dead, and it was time to stop acting like he was. The next morning he found Tori in the kitchen, mixing dough for bread. The early morning light slanted through the window, turning her hair to burnished copper. She looked up when he entered, wariness in her eyes. "Morning," she said carefully. "Morning. Tori, can we talk?" She set down the dough, wiping her hands on her apron. Of course. Daniel suddenly didn't know where to start. He'd rehearsed this in his head a dozen times, but now, facing her, the words tangled on his tongue. "I want to apologize," he finally said, "for pulling away this past week. It wasn't fair to you." "Daniel, you don't owe me an explanation. I understand this situation is complicated." "It is," he agreed, "but not for the reasons you might think. Tori, when you first came here, it was just a business arrangement. You needed work. I needed help. But somewhere along the way that changed. For me, at least. And I've been fighting it because it felt like I was betraying Sarah's memory. But I realized last night that the real betrayal would be refusing to live because she's gone." Tori had gone very still, her eyes wide. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you've become important to me. More than just someone who works in my house. I look forward to our conversations. I notice when you're not around. When you were helping during the fire, all I could think about was keeping you safe. I don't know if you feel the same way, and I'm not asking you to. I just needed to be honest about where I stand." For a long moment, Tori didn't speak. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, but it lit up her entire face. "I was beginning to think I was imagining things. I've been fighting the same battle, Daniel. Trying to tell myself that what I feel is just gratitude for you giving me a place when I had nowhere else to go. But it's more than that. I care about you. I want to see you happy. And when you started pulling away, I thought maybe I'd misread everything, that you still saw me as just an employee." Relief flooded through Daniel, so powerful it made him dizzy. "Never just an employee. You've brought this place back to life. You've brought me back to life even when I was fighting it." "So what happens now?" Tori asked softly. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "We could keep going as we have been, or we could see where this goes. Whatever you're comfortable with. There's no rush. We've both been married before." "We know this isn't something to take lightly." Tori nodded slowly. "I'd like to see where this goes, but slowly, Daniel. We both need time to be sure." "Slow sounds good." They smiled at each other across the kitchen, and Daniel felt something in his chest that had been frozen since Sarah's death begin to thaw. It wasn't the desperate, all-consuming passion of youth. It was something gentler, but no less real. The quiet certainty that he'd found someone who understood him, who'd walked through fire both literal and metaphorical, and who was brave enough to risk her heart one more time. The summer rolled on, and their relationship deepened by small degrees. Daniel started helping Tori with evening dishes, their hands brushing in the soapy water, conversations flowing easily. They took rides together in the relative cool of early morning, Daniel showing her the full extent of his property, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories. Tori taught him how to make Sarah's flower beds flourish, patiently explaining which plants needed more water, which preferred shade. Working side by side in the garden, their shoulders touching, felt more intimate than any embrace. They were careful not to give the town gossips too much to talk about. Tori still had her own room, and Daniel was scrupulous about propriety, but everyone in Williams knew something had changed. When they attended the 4th of July celebration in town, they arrived together, and Daniel's hand rested comfortably on the small of Tori's back as they navigated through the crowds. The knowing looks and smiles they received made Tori blush, but Daniel found he didn't mind. Let people talk. He was proud to be seen with her. The celebration was held in the town square, with tables laden with food, a band playing patriotic songs, and children running wild with sparklers once darkness fell. Daniel and Tori found themselves surrounded by friends and neighbors, all eager to chat. Sarah Palmer cornered Tori almost immediately, pulling her away to meet some other ranchers' wives. Miguel appeared at Daniel's elbow with a knowing grin. "Looks like you took my advice, boss." "Looks like," Daniel agreed, watching Tori laugh at something one of the women said. She looked happy, truly happy in a way he hadn't seen before. The weight she'd carried when she first arrived had lifted. "You planning to make this official?" Miguel asked. Daniel hadn't let himself think that far ahead, but now, watching Tori, the answer seemed obvious. "Eventually. When she's ready. We're taking it slow." "Don't take it too slow. Woman like that won't stay available forever." But Daniel knew there was no rush. He and Tori had both learned that life was unpredictable, that tomorrow was promised to no one. That made every day they had together precious, not something to be rushed through. They would know when the time was right. August arrived with temperatures that turned the landscape bronze and gold. The cattle huddled in what shade they could find, and work became an exercise in endurance. Daniel's thoughts turned to the fall roundup, to preparing for winter, to all the endless tasks that came with running a ranch. But now, when he came in from the heat, there was cool water waiting, clean shirts, and meals that reminded him he was more than just a rancher. He was a man with someone to come home to. It was a Saturday evening in mid-August when everything changed. They'd spent the day in town, buying supplies and attending to business. The ride home was pleasant, the sun low enough that the heat had broken, a breeze carrying the scent of sage across the range. They were talking about nothing in particular, easy conversation that required no thought. When Tori suddenly grew quiet, Daniel glanced at her. Something wrong? No, she said slowly. Not wrong, just thinking. About, she was quiet for another moment, then said, about how strange life is. 6 months ago, I was convinced I'd never be happy again. I'd lost 2 husbands, my home, everything I'd built. I felt like God was punishing me for something, though I couldn't figure out what. And now, here I am, feeling something I wasn't sure I'd ever feel again. What's that? Hope. Happiness. Like maybe I'm allowed to have a future after all. Daniel reached over and took her hand, not caring that they were in the open where anyone could see. You're allowed, Tori. We both are. She squeezed his hand, and they rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence. But Daniel's mind was working. He'd been content to let things develop slowly, but Miguel's words echoed in his head. Don't take it too slow. He loved Tori. He was sure of that now. And he was pretty sure she loved him too, though neither of them had said the words. Why wait? They weren't kids who needed long courtships to be sure. They were adults who'd loved and lost and found each other through their grief. What more did they need to know? That night after dinner, Daniel asked Tori to walk with him. They strolled away from the house, up the gentle rise where Sarah was buried. Daniel had continued to visit the grave regularly, keeping the weeds cleared, the marker clean. He'd worried that bringing Tori here might be uncomfortable, but she'd never objected. She understood that his love for Sarah didn't diminish what he felt for her. They were different loves from different times in his life, and both were real. They stood looking out at the ranch spread below them, bathed in twilight. Daniel took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Tori, I brought you up here for a reason. I wanted Sarah to be part of this in a way. She was my first love, and I'll always carry her with me. But she's gone, and life goes on. She made me promise to keep living, to be happy. For a long time, I thought that was impossible. Then you came along. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. You've shown me that it's possible to heal, to find joy again, even after loss. You've made me laugh again, made me think about the future instead of just getting through each day. I love you, Tori. I know we said we'd take this slow, but I'm 32 years old and I've already lost too much time. I don't want to lose any more. Will you marry me? Tori's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Daniel pulled her close, kissing her properly for the first time. It was sweet and gentle and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Tori laughed, wiping at her tears. I should have guessed you'd propose at sunset. Richard always said beauty is easier to find if you know where to look, and Sarah said every dawn is a fresh start. Maybe sunsets and sunrises are both right. Endings and beginnings all mixed together. Sounds about right, Daniel agreed, keeping her close. We've both had our share of endings. Time for some beginnings. They were married 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in the Williams church. The whole town turned out for the wedding, eager to celebrate what everyone had seen coming for months. Tori wore a simple dress of pale blue, altered from one the ranchers' wives had insisted on giving her. Daniel wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed within an inch of its life. Miguel stood as his best man, while Sarah Palmer acted as Tori's matron of honor. The ceremony was short and sweet, the minister speaking of second chances and the courage to love again. When Daniel slipped a simple gold band on Tori's finger, his hands were steady. When he kissed his new wife, the church erupted in applause. They walked out into the bright September sunlight as man and wife, ready to face whatever came next together. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed an army. Daniel had tried to keep things simple, but the community had other ideas. Everyone brought something, dishes and decorations and good wishes. The afternoon was filled with music and laughter, children running wild, adults swapping stories and enjoying a rare day of leisure. As the sun began to set, Daniel found himself standing with Tori on the porch, watching their neighbors and friends enjoy themselves. His arm was around her waist, and she was leaning into him, comfortable and relaxed. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I thought possible," she replied. "You?" "Yes. Very much yes." They watched the sunset together, the sky turning brilliant colors, and Daniel thought about all the sunsets he'd watched alone, weighted down with grief, and all the sunrises he'd faced with dread, wondering how he'd make it through another day. Those days felt distant now, like they'd happened to a different person. He was still Daniel Jackson, still carried the scars of loss, but he wasn't the same broken man who'd stood at Sarah's grave 5 months ago. Tori had helped him heal, had shown him that healing was possible. As if reading his thoughts, Tori said quietly, "We're going to be all right, aren't we, both of us?" "Yes," Daniel said with certainty. "We are." The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of seasons and work and quiet happiness. Fall brought the roundup, with Daniel gone long hours and coming home exhausted to find Tori waiting with hot meals and warmer smiles. Winter was mild by Arizona standards, but there were still cold nights when they huddled close to the fireplace, talking or reading or simply enjoying each other's company. Spring returned with new calves and the endless work of keeping a ranch running. And through it all, their bond deepened. They learned each other's rhythms, the small habits and quirks that make up a life together. Daniel discovered that Tori sang while she worked, old songs from her childhood in Missouri. Tori learned that Daniel got quiet when he was worried about money or weather, or the 100 other things that kept a rancher up at night, and that the best thing she could do was just be present until he was ready to talk. They had their disagreements, usually about small things, but they learned to talk through problems instead of letting resentment build. Their first Christmas together was special. Tori decorated the house with pine boughs and holly, filling the rooms with the scent of winter. She baked cookies and pies, filling the pantry with sweets that the ranch hands devoured. Daniel gave her a music box he'd sent away to Tucson for, its delicate mechanism playing a waltz that made her cry happy tears. She gave him a new saddle blanket she'd woven herself, working on it secretly for months. They attended Christmas service in town, hosted dinner for Miguel and a few of the other hands who had nowhere else to go, and spent the evening dancing in the parlor to the music box's tune. It was in February, a year after Richard Caldwell's death, and almost a year since Sarah's, that Tori discovered she was pregnant. She'd had her suspicions for a few weeks, but she'd waited to be sure before telling Daniel. When she finally shared the news one evening over dinner, he was struck speechless. Then he was up and around the table, pulling her into his arms, his face a mix of joy and terror. "Are you sure?" he asked. "As sure as I can be. I've missed 2 monthly courses and I've been sick every morning this week. I think we're going to have a baby, Daniel." "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. Then his expression shifted to concern. "Are you all right? Is it dangerous? Should you be working so hard?" Tori laughed, touched by his worry. "I'm fine. Women have babies every day. I'll be careful, I promise. But Daniel, I'm healthy and strong. This is a good thing." "It's a wonderful thing," he said and kissed her soundly. "A baby, our baby." The news spread quickly through the community, met with warm congratulations. The ranchers' wives showered Tori with advice, some welcome, some alarming. Sarah Palmer in particular took Tori under her wing, having successfully raised 5 children of her own. Daniel became ridiculously protective, trying to prevent Tori from doing anything strenuous, until she firmly told him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. As spring turned to summer, and Tori's belly grew round, Daniel found himself planning for the future in ways he hadn't since Sarah's death. He repaired the nursery that Sarah had started, painting the walls a cheerful yellow and building a cradle from oak wood. He worked with renewed purpose, knowing he was building not just for himself now, but for his growing family. Miguel teased him mercilessly about his nervous energy, but there was approval in the foreman's eyes. The baby came in early October, during a week of unseasonably cool weather. Tori's labor started in the evening, and Daniel immediately rode for the doctor and the midwife. The next 12 hours were the longest of his life. He paced the porch, unable to settle, jumping at every sound from inside the house. Miguel sat with him, keeping him company, occasionally forcing him to eat or drink something. When the baby's cry finally pierced the night, Daniel nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife appeared in the doorway, smiling broadly. "You have a son, Mr. Jackson, a healthy boy. And your wife is doing just fine." Daniel rushed inside to find Tori propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she'd made. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small, fussing noises, his face red and wrinkled. "He's perfect," Daniel breathed. "He is," Tori agreed. "Would you like to hold him?" With infinite care, Daniel took his son in his arms. The baby was so small, so fragile, but his grip was strong when Daniel's finger found his tiny hand. Looking down at his child, Daniel felt a rush of emotion so powerful it stole his breath. Love, fierce and protective. Hope for the future. Gratitude for this second chance at family, at happiness. "What should we name him?" Tori asked softly. Daniel had thought about this. "I'd like to call him Thomas Richard, if that's all right with you, after both your husbands. They were part of bringing you to me in a way. Without them, we might never have met." Tears spilled down Tori's cheeks. "That's perfect. Thomas Richard Jackson, Tommy for short." Daniel carefully placed the baby back in Tori's arms, then leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Thank you for him, for everything, for bringing me back to life." "We brought each other back," Tori corrected gently. "That's how this works." Tommy proved to be a good baby, healthy and strong, with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Daniel threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything else, learning to change diapers and walk the floor with a colicky infant in the middle of the night. Tori marveled at his dedication, watching him gentle this tough rancher with their son. As Tommy grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Daniel made smart decisions about breeding stock and took advantage of good market prices for beef. He was able to hire more hands, expand his grazing land, and make improvements to the house. The nursery became a bedroom for a growing boy, and talk turned to adding more rooms to the house for the siblings Tori and Daniel both hoped would come. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Victoria, arrived 2 years after Tommy. She was a tiny, delicate thing, with her father's dark hair and her mother's smile. Daniel wept when he held her for the first time, overcome with emotion at naming this child after his first wife. Tori had suggested it, saying Sarah deserved to be remembered and honored. The gesture felt like a final healing, a way to bring all the pieces of their pasts into their present. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch demanded constant work, but Daniel no longer felt like he was drowning in it. With Tori at his side, managing the house and the children, with Miguel running the day-to-day operations, Daniel could focus on the bigger picture. He became involved in territorial politics, working with other ranchers to secure better prices and fairer treatment from the railroad companies and eastern buyers. His opinion was sought and respected. The ranch grew from a modest operation into one of the most successful in the region. Through it all, Daniel and Tori's love deepened. It wasn't always easy. Raising children while running a ranch tested them both. There were lean years when drought threatened everything, and they had to make hard decisions about selling off stock. There were illnesses, injuries, and the 100 small crises that make up any life. But they faced everything together, their partnership the bedrock on which their family was built. Years passed in the way they do when life is full and busy. Tommy grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ranch from the ground up. Sarah became a bright, curious child who asked 1,000 questions and kept her mother constantly entertained. A third child, another son they named Miguel Daniel after the foreman who'd become family, arrived when Tommy was 6. The house rang with the sounds of children's laughter and running feet. Daniel found himself often thinking of that terrible spring when Sarah had died, when he'd stood at her grave convinced his life was over. It seemed impossible that he'd ever been that broken, that lost. But he also knew that without that pain, he might never have opened himself to love again. Grief had hollowed him out, made space for something new to grow. And what had grown was more beautiful than he could have imagined. On their 10th anniversary, Daniel and Tori took a rare day off, leaving the children with Miguel's wife, Rosa, who joined them at the ranch after she and Miguel had finally married. They rode out to a spot on the range that had become special to them, a high meadow with views stretching for miles, where wildflowers bloomed in spring and the grass stayed green even in summer's heat. They spread a blanket and shared the lunch Tori had packed, enjoying the peace and the privacy. It was a warm October day, the sky that brilliant blue unique to Arizona. After they ate, they lay back on the blanket, hands clasped, watching clouds drift by. "You ever think about how we started?" Tori asked. "Two broken people who'd lost everything trying to survive." "All the time," Daniel admitted. "And I thank God for every step that brought us together, even the painful ones." "Me too. I never thought I'd have this, Daniel, a real home, children, a husband I love more than I knew it was possible to love someone. When Richard died and I lost the ranch, I thought that was it for me. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, working whatever jobs I could find, just existing. You gave me so much more than a job. You gave me a reason to keep living." Daniel rolled onto his side to look at her. "We gave that to each other. I was dead inside when you came, Tori, just going through the motions. You reminded me what it felt like to be alive, to want things, to hope." "The rancher who lost his wife and the widow who lost her home," Tori said softly. "We both thought what we'd had was gone forever. We were wrong." "No," Daniel corrected gently. "We found something different, not the same as what we lost, but just as real, just as precious, maybe more so because we know how fragile it all is." Tori reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle on his weathered skin. "I love you, Daniel Jackson. I love Thomas in my way and Richard in his, but what I feel for you is different, deeper. Like we were always supposed to find each other, but we had to walk through fire first to be ready." "I love you too," Daniel said and kissed her, putting 10 years of devotion into it. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. They spent the afternoon in that meadow, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for the future. Tommy was already talking about taking over the ranch someday, though he was only 10. Sarah had announced she wanted to be a teacher, inspired by the schoolmarm in Williams who'd taken her under her wing. Little Miguel was still too young to have ambitions beyond catching frogs in the creek and annoying his siblings, but they had high hopes for him too. "We've built something good here," Daniel said as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. "A real legacy. Not just the ranch, but the family, the life. 20 years ago, I never could have imagined this. 20 years ago, I was just a girl in Missouri dreaming of adventure, Tori replied. I got more adventure than I bargained for, but I can't regret any of it. It all led here. As they rode back to the ranch in the golden light of evening, Daniel thought about the twisting path his life had taken. The love and loss, the grief and healing, the second chances he'd been given when he'd thought there were none left. He thought about Sarah, buried on the hill overlooking the ranch, her memory honored but no longer a weight on his heart. He thought about Tori's first husbands, the men who'd loved her and lost her, their names carried on in their children. He thought about all the people who'd helped them along the way, Miguel and the ranching families and the whole community of Williams that had supported them. Most of all, he thought about Tori, riding beside him now, her face content in the fading light. The widow who'd lost everything and somehow found the courage to risk her heart one more time. The woman who'd brought his house and his heart back to life. His wife, his partner, his love. The ranch came into view as they crested the final rise. They could see the children playing in the yard, Rosa watching from the porch. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and dinner and all the comfortable routines of home. The cattle were settling for the night, and somewhere a coyote called to the rising moon. "Ready to go home?" Tori asked. "More than ready," Daniel replied. They rode down together, toward the light and laughter and the life they'd built from the ashes of their losses. Two people who'd thought they'd lost everything, who'd found each other in their darkest moments, and who'd learned that endings could become beginnings if you had the courage to let them. The years continued to unfold in the way of good lives fully lived. The ranch prospered through careful management and favorable markets. Daniel's reputation as a fair dealer and knowledgeable cattleman spread beyond Williams, bringing buyers from as far as California. He never forgot the lessons of those early years, though never took prosperity for granted. He maintained strong relationships with his neighbors, was first to help when trouble struck another ranch, and treated his hands with respect that earned their loyalty. Tori became the heart of not just their home but the wider community. She organized church socials, helped establish a proper school in Williams, and was always the first to arrive when a neighbor needed assistance. Her own experiences with loss made her particularly sensitive to others' pain, and many a grieving soul found comfort in her kitchen, drinking coffee and finding someone who truly understood. Tommy grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's kind heart. He took to ranching naturally, learning not just the work but the business side, preparing for the day he'd take over. Sarah fulfilled her ambition to become a teacher, studying with the schoolmarm and eventually taking over the one-room schoolhouse when her mentor retired. Young Miguel proved to be the family wild card, more interested in the new technologies beginning to reshape the West than in cattle. He devoured books about engineering and mechanics, already talking about the railroad expansion and electricity, and all the changes coming. Daniel and Tori welcomed 2 more children over the years, another son and another daughter, bringing their total to 5. The house had to be expanded twice to accommodate everyone, until it was hardly recognizable from the lonely bachelor's dwelling Tori had first entered all those years ago. It was filled with noise and life, with children's voices and laughter, with love in every room. As Daniel moved into his 50s and his hair turned more silver than brown, he found himself increasingly grateful for the path his life had taken. Yes, he'd lost Sarah, and that loss had nearly destroyed him. But from that destruction had come something beautiful and lasting. He'd learned that the human heart has an infinite capacity for love, that loving again doesn't diminish what came before, but rather honors it by refusing to let grief be the final word. One spring evening, as he and Tori sat on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Tommy having married a rancher's daughter from Flagstaff, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. The ranch would go on. The family would continue. The love he and Tori had built together had created something that would outlast them both. "What are you thinking?" Tori asked, reaching for his hand. Even after all these years, that simple gesture still sent warmth through him. "Just counting my blessings," Daniel replied. "Thinking about how lucky I am." "We both are," Tori said, "though I'm not sure luck is the right word. Maybe blessed is better, or maybe just stubborn. We refused to give up, even when it would have been easier to." "That sounds about right," Daniel agreed. As the sun set, painting the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel thought about sunsets and sunrises, endings and beginnings. He thought about the rancher who'd lost his wife and the widow who'd lost her home. Two broken people who'd found each other and, in finding each other, had discovered that what they thought was gone forever could be found again in a different form. Love, home, hope, purpose. All of it had seemed impossible in those dark days after Sarah's death. But Tori had shown him it was possible, had walked beside him through grief and out the other side into a life more rich and full than he'd dared to imagine. The last of the daylight faded, and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Tori leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. In the yard, their grandchildren continued playing, their voices carrying on the warm evening air. Inside the house, Rosa was preparing dinner, and Daniel could smell bread baking. This was home. This was family. This was the life they'd built together from the ruins of their losses, and it was good, better than good. It was everything. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly. "For what?" Tori asked. "For taking a chance on a grief-stricken rancher who had nothing to offer but a job and a messy house. For bringing life back to this place. For giving me a reason to keep going. For loving me." Tori lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes soft in the twilight. "Thank you for seeing past a widow with bad luck and no prospects. For giving me a home when I had nowhere to go. For your patience and your kindness and your love. For showing me that it's possible to survive loss and still find happiness." They kissed, a soft meeting of lips that spoke of years together and years yet to come. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come on," Tori said, standing and pulling him up. "Let us go inside. Dinner will be ready soon and the children will be expecting us." Daniel followed her into the house, into the warmth and light and love they'd created together. Behind them, the last of the sunset faded, and night settled over the ranch. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, marking the passage of time, witnessing the small but significant triumph of two people who'd refused to let loss have the final word. In the years that followed, as Daniel and Tori grew older together, their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, tested by time and challenge and emerging victorious. They faced illness and recovered together. They dealt with the inevitable losses that come with age, friends and neighbors passing, the older generation giving way to the new. Through it all, they remained each other's constant, the anchor in every storm. Daniel lived to see Tommy take over the ranch, managing it with the same care and dedication his father had shown. He lived to see Sarah's students flourish, including his own younger children. He lived to see young Miguel head east to study engineering, following his dreams while always knowing he had a home to return to. He lived to see his children married and happy, to hold more grandchildren than he could count, to know that the legacy he and Tori had built would continue long after they were gone. When Daniel Jackson finally passed, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Tori beside him as she'd been for nearly 40 years. He went knowing he'd lived a good life. A full life. A life marked by both profound loss and profound love, and that the love had won in the end. Tori mourned him as she'd mourned Thomas and Richard before him. But this grief was different. She'd had 40 years with Daniel, 40 years of partnership and passion and growing old together. She'd been blessed beyond measure, and while she missed him terribly, she also knew she'd been given a gift. Not one person, not two, but 3 men who'd loved her truly. 3 chances at happiness. 3 homes, 3 families, 3 lives woven together into one rich tapestry. She lived another 5 years after Daniel's death, surrounded by children and grandchildren, content in the knowledge that she'd lived fully and loved deeply. When she joined Daniel on the hill overlooking the ranch, buried beside him with Sarah nearby, their graves were marked with stones that told their story. Daniel Jackson, beloved husband and father. Victoria Jackson, beloved wife and mother. Together they found what they thought was gone. The ranch continued, generation after generation, the land tended by Daniel and Tori's descendants. The house remained, expanded and modernized over the years, but still fundamentally the same structure where 2 broken people had learned to heal together. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Arizona landscape, painting the sky in brilliant colors, those who knew the story would sometimes pause and remember the rancher who lost his wife, the widow who lost her home. Together they found what they thought was gone. Not a return to what was, but something new and equally precious. A second chance. A new beginning. A love that proved stronger than loss, deeper than grief, and lasting beyond even death itself. And in that, there was hope for everyone who'd ever lost and wondered if they could find again. The answer, Daniel and Tori's story proclaimed, was yes. Always yes, if you had the courage to try.